The European Commission is proposing establishing a fund of up to €100 billion to support war-torn Ukraine during the bloc's next 2028-2024 budget period. EU Budget Chief Piotr Serafin said this is a long-term commitment to Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. He added the money would be outside the ceiling of the budget. Well, let's hear from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen.
We are setting aside €100 billion for Ukraine. You know we have the Ukraine facility for reconstruction. It was initially, with the midterm review, filled with 50 billion. These are slowly but surely going down in the amounts, and therefore we are suggesting €100 billion to fill up again the Ukraine facility to support recovery, resilience, and of course their path to the EU membership.
President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Let's bring in Dave Keating. Dave, of course, our Europe correspondent, joining us live from Brussels. Dave, we need your intake here because it strikes me there are two elephants in this particular room, Slovakia and Hungary. Are they on side with this?
Well, in terms of the spending, we haven't heard a major objection from them from this part of the budget. Actually, what Hungary is complaining about more is that this budget is going to explicitly link following the rule of law to receiving EU funds. And also, quite interestingly, the frozen EU funds that would be withheld from Hungary or any other government found to be breaking the rule of law would actually go to NGOs, which is a particular needle toward Viktor Orban. In terms of this funding, it was expected, this amount. It's out of a total budget line item of 200 billion for foreign affairs. That's a big change from the previous budget. And in general, this long-term budget is pretty different from the previous one because it has new elements of flexibility. And that's precisely because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the experience of that during President von der Leyen's first term, because normally these 7-year budgets are locked in, they're really rigid. Now we have this new flexibility introduced where funding can go toward emergency situations. Of course, this 100 billion euros that's been pledged to Ukraine, not flexible, that's definitely going to Ukraine. That's part of an overall 2 trillion euro long-term budget. That's up from the current budget term of 1.2 trillion. So a big increase, but the Commission says it's necessary for these unprecedented and challenging times that the EU finds itself in.
Indeed, they are such times indeed, Dave, aren't they? With the weaponry coming from the United States in some way, shape or form via various different ways, finding its way to Ukraine, and this concept of this big budget being put aside to help Ukraine, is it some kind of dovetailing of efforts to help Ukraine in this fight against Russia? Would you view it as that?
Well, certainly I think that the news from the United States that essentially the U.S. will not block European countries from purchasing weapons to give to Ukraine was very welcome in Kyiv. Today's announcement will be very welcome in Kyiv. We are seeing a big movement towards increased weapons supplied to Ukraine, increased funding, and that's going to be very encouraging. However, it should be kept in mind here that the money that we're talking about in this fund is over the next long term up to 2034. So in the short term, it doesn't really do much to help Ukraine. And certainly when we're talking about long-term weapons deliveries, it doesn't do much to help Ukraine right in this moment. So I think for Ukraine that the big key here is the diplomacy aspect. Can Donald Trump, if Donald Trump kind of maintains his annoyance with Vladimir Putin, as we seem to be in the current period, at least for this week, that's probably more key to them at this moment than some of this funding, which is more long-term.
A second vote on Russian sanctions, David, has led nowhere. Tell us why.
Yeah, we're still having Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico blocking this 18th package of sanctions against Russia. That package calls for the complete phase out of Russian energy imports by 2028. Slovakian government is saying they can't do that, that it would hurt their economy too much. They've been offering all kinds of concessions, an emergency brake to allow them to import Russian gas if the price spikes too much, a study to see how the Slovakia would be impacted, dedicated funding for Slovakia. Robert Fico is not budging, even as today as these talks continued. And this is starting to look more ideological than about actual economic concerns for Slovakia. Of course, Robert Fico is no friend to Ukraine. Like Viktor Orban, they are calling for Ukraine to essentially surrender in the war and for Russia to be able to have a negotiated peace. So it seems like the talks they're going to have now are turning more political. And that is really irritating a lot of people here in Brussels. Particularly, you can tell the foreign affairs chief for the EU, Kaja Kallas, who said yesterday that she is very sad about the way that Slovakia is behaving. But because this requires unanimity, because it's a foreign policy issue, they have to get Robert Fico's assent to launch this latest package of sanctions and to have this plan to phase out the Russian oil and gas.
Dave Keating, as always, thank you very much indeed. Dave Keating, our correspondent there in Brussels.